Liquid just published a piece about StarCraft players, both in Brood War and in StarCraft 2, who are famous for being the kings of silver. These are the guys who picked up always silver medals. They always seem to lose. And it's a great topic. It's one that I've thought about often because, yes, obviously the most compelling people usually in competitive, especially 1v1 games, are the guys who have a lot of talent and they're always making these finals, but somehow they lose repeatedly. And within that, there's an interesting story about that because it's the nature of, obviously, they're very good. The fact that if you get to a final once and you lose, okay, maybe it was a fluke. Maybe you just weren't even as good. Maybe you were like the fifth best player. You had an awesome bracket, just a couple of good upset wins. Maybe a guy that you were playing against broke down and that's the only reason you got through a semi-final. But if you make that repeatedly, there's a sense that, okay, you could win. It's legitimate. And some of these finals, maybe you're even the favorite in. So if you keep losing, just in the same way we kind of are naturally drawn to and intrigued and curious about the guys who win repeatedly, the MVP, Flash, Jaedong in Brood, or these sorts of people, because they win over and over. Part of the interest isn't just watching them win and how amazing they are, which is obviously a baseline level. It's this aspect of like, how do they keep doing it? Like, how are they able to summon the same kind of abilities and courage in the face of adversity, and how are they able to just come back again and again when other people know their style and still manage to win? What is it about these guys? What are they made of? What is this fire inside of them? In the same way, the guys who lose, it's kind of a thing of what's stopping them winning? Like what's the difference between them and the guy who wins this time? And is there a general trend that appears here? And are they lacking something, or does something break down inside them? In the same way as the champion maybe has this stern inner resolute core, or this ability to return. Do these guys just crumble when they're under pressure in that sense? Do they not have something within that's like a baseline level that they can go down to this place and then regroup and then come back somehow? Is there something lacking in them? These are the questions we can ask and the implications that get drawn from these matches. But what was interesting about this piece kind of brought up a couple of the famous names, but it wasn't like comprehensive. And so since it's a topic I've thought about a lot, I was thinking about some of the names in this piece and also some of the names I would add. And I want to kind of go through some of these because there's some interesting factors at play here when we talk about these guys who are the kings of silver, because it's not just enough to be famous for getting silver medals. Part of this, and if you're going to be what in Korean Brood War was called a Kong, and this all came after Yellow's, a nickname for Yellow, where he was the guy who'd always finish second and never won the big tournament. A key quality of being one of these people that I've noticed that hasn't been very well defined by a lot of other people is that if you're going to be a Kong, if you're going to be a king of silver, you can still be one, in a sense, even if you eventually do win. Like, yes, Yellow never wins, so it's easy with him to go, he's a king of silver. But a lot of the other names that you're going to mention, especially in Brood War, a lot of them actually eventually did win the big tournament, and they did have their moment of triumph, and it did work out for once. But it's the way that happened that defines whether they kind of remain in our minds as a king of silver, kind of a loser in a sense. Because, and that's actually another factor, let me just pick up on that as well. I think people go too far as well when they think about trying to weigh up these guys who are losing. Yes, they're losing on the biggest stage, so it seems like the biggest kind of loss and an ultimate loss, and wow. And people could think of them as a loser. They're only a loser in the context of the greatest players of all time. As soon as you get out of the people who essentially are the greatest winners, these are the next best people in general. Like, there's people who won OSLs, okay. I'll give you an example. There was a guy, Casey, he won one, who just basically only won. He could only play TVZ, and he just got an awesome bracket and went through. There was a whole bunch of other ones, like one-off winners we're talking about here. So we can have Luxury in the MSL, where he won one. These players were not greater, in the context of their time or in history, greater than Yellow. And Yellow never won a tournament. So it's not the same as like you're an ultimate loser. It's that just in this particular sense of when you're comparing them to the greatest players of all time, yeah, they're not at that level, partly because they couldn't get over this hump. But as I kind of said there, it's not enough that you simply win eventually, because actually here's the way I'd contrast it. Okay, there are actual examples of people who won, but if they won early, then they could lose a bunch of times, and they were never thought of in this way. They were never thought of as losers or lacking anything. So a great example. So okay, to use an example in Brood War, I'll give you two Brood War examples. In Brood War, Stork is famous for losing his first three big finals in terms of OSL and MSLs, and yet he then won one. Let me think, was it his first three? Let me think. Yeah, he lost his first three, and then he won one. But even though he won the one after, because he'd lost those first three, we still think of him today as like, oh, he was always a guy who was tormented, he got those silvers. But eventually he won one, but that didn't really change that. Fantasy lost his first two finals, eventually won one, but again, you still kind of think of him as a guy who's a bit of a loser. I mean, admittedly, he lost some finals afterwards, but even so, he's still thought of as a Kong in this sense. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, okay, Boxer won his first 2 finals. He then lost something like, I think he then lost, let me think, he lost, no, he won his first 3 finals if you count the MSL as well. So he's won his first 3, awesome. But then he managed to lose, let me see, he lost 1 to Reach, and then he lost 1 to, who would the others have been to? Anytime and I Love Uvi. So he lost 3 finals after that. So he won 3, lost 3. He's not in any possible sense thought of as a loser or Kong or King of Silver. He actually got as many silvers as he did golds in terms of just these tournaments, not counting WCGs and stuff. No one thinks of him that way. Go over and have a great example to contrast against Stork and Fantasy there would be Reach. Won his first final. He beat Boxer, the hero. He managed to stop Boxer getting 3 in a row. But then he lost his next 2. In fact, I think he lost 3 finals after that. We don't think of him as a loser in any sense. And yet actually, Stork reached more finals, won just as many titles as Reach in this sense. Yet we do kind of think of Stork in this particular sense. It's just kind of the way it works out like that. Now, going beyond that, I think there's a way you can categorize these sorts of guys who are losing in this sense. Because even once you're getting lots and lots of silvers, not all silvers are equal in that sense. Let me just make a contrasting point there in that sense, actually. Yeah, okay, so not all silvers are equal. Like, there's a big difference between, I'd say, losing finals when you're playing against gods. So these are either the greatest players of all time you're playing against, or great players. The greatest players of all time in general, so they can return and they can summon that again. That's the ability to come back, where great normal players maybe have a peak once and then drop off. So you're either playing the best ever or the best ever, and they're in their prime right now. That's even more difficult. Like right now, they're in beast mode. They're completely dominant. Everything's working for them. It's their meta. Their skills are at their peak. No one's figured out how to stop them. When you're playing that sort of a person, I'll be honest with you, I don't really begrudge you losing in that scenario, because in some of those cases, it's that you could have put anyone in there. You could have took another great player who maybe won all his finals, but he didn't get to this final. Put him in there, and maybe he loses there. And now we think of him as a loser if he loses 3 in a row to that guy. In this particular sense, I don't really think of that as... I think that's a bit harsh to kind of say that player's a loser because he lost then, because he lost to a god. I mean, to give you a kind of I'll give you a literary example, okay? Famously in the book The Iliad, which is the Greek story by Homer of the Trojan War, and it's the Greeks against the Trojans, and they're sieging Troy. And one of the core storylines within this overarching story is of the hero of Troy is Prince Hector, and he's a great warrior, and he's a man who kind of has a lot of courage for his family, and he wants to protect people, and he's the kind of guy who just wants to do what's right, and he's quite an egalitarian sort of guy. And he represents like the best of Troy. And then on the other side, you have Achilles, who's literally like a demigod in the sense of like that's where he's spawned from, and his mother dipped him into this pool everywhere except his ankles, and he's kind of invulnerable to a degree, and he has the favor of the gods on his side. Like, I think it's Athena is the one who always helps him out. And so these two guys, who are both in different ways blessed by the gods, are the two sort of mightiest men of their eras. These are the two greatest men of their eras, but they're on opposite sides of a war. And eventually, through the way the story works out, they end up having to battle each other. And they have this battle, and in this battle, Achilles kills Hector. Remember what I just said there? Hector can't know this in the story, but Achilles actually, to a degree, unless you know his weak spot, can't be killed, essentially. And he has the gods on his side. So he's going to win this battle no matter what. And actually, the way the story goes, one of the gods kind of does help out, and he trips up Hector. In this particular sense, Hector can't do anything here. He could be the second greatest person ever in history and second best warrior in the whole world, but he's going to lose this battle. That's kind of how I'd pit it when you get into a final where you're in it versus a god. So some examples of that would be like, that's why when I do this list here, I'll have Jaedong in the list for StarCraft 2, but I don't have him in for Brood War, because the 3 finals that he lost in Brood War in a row to end his Brood War career were against Flash in utter god mode, probably the best player ever in the history of StarCraft 2. And Jaedong's level to get to those finals repeatedly 3 in a row was like incredibly high himself. So against almost anyone else, he would have won a bunch of those finals. At least one, hey, maybe 2 or even 3, since Jaedong was one of the greatest winners ever in Brood War. So that doesn't count as like you're a loser because you lost those. Now there's another type of final that you do have to bring up, which is, this is the sort of finals where it's not that you're facing gods, or maybe you face a god once, but next time you face just a good player in his peak, then another time you face someone who's maybe not even that great, just a good player overall. If you're facing different people and the only thread in these finals is it's you, that's the only real pattern we can take, is that when you get to a final, you tend to lose. Now this one I would describe as like, okay, to quote Beck, the great multi-talent, multi-genre musician talent, There's a song he has called Nobody's Fault But My Own. That's the way I describe this sort of a loss. This is like, actually, the problem here is you. Something about you breaks down, you aren't good under pressure, and at the end of the day, it feels like you could play almost anyone and you could lose them. You could beat most of these people probably in a semi-final, but if you got to a final, somehow you'd find a way to lose against them. I think we have to separate those two categories, and I'll try and use that criteria as I break down some of these names. So what I'll do first of all is I'll break down the names that were in the actual Team Liquid list, and as I do it, I'll kind of rank like where I think they really deserve to be in terms of like greatest Kings of Silver. Like how much did they really fit that billing? How much is some of it just like a bit forced, or they're not quite, not even maybe at that level of reaching that many silvers. So we'll start off with the ultimate one, the guy who started this all in the first place, which is Yellow, the King of Kongs, if you will. And I have to say, I'll start off immediately as I describe this guy by saying, you can just, if you want to know who's number one, this guy's number one already. And here's why. He made it to 10 OSL or MSL top 4. He made it to the round of 4 10 times. He made it to the final, let me think, 5 times in OSLs and MSLs. So 10 times he makes semi-finals, 5 times final, 0 titles. Now that's just, you can't beat that. If you want to be the best at getting silvers, you're just the best. Now then, of those, okay, first of all, he made the Coca-Cola OSL final in 2001. He loses to Boxer there. This is when Boxer's absolutely in his prime, and Boxer's the first truly great player, who's like the first Bonjour level player, who's just above everyone. He then, at the same time, roughly, makes it to the final of the first KPGA Tour, which was what would become the MSL later, but it had a different name in the beginning. He plays Boxer again. He loses to Boxer again. Boxer's in his prime. At this point, this particular scenario is a sort of a Hector versus Achilles type scenario. You're Hector. Sorry, you're in the area of Achilles. Not a lot you can do there. He made it to the final of the next KPGA Tour. He plays Nada there. This is Nada's rise. Nada's probably, before Flash came along and dominated, Nada was the greatest player in the history of Brood War. So again, you're losing to a god here. You can't really blame the guy for this one. He made it to the final of the WCG in 2002 and played Boxer there. Now, Boxer had just come out of his prime now, but it's still Boxer. This one's not quite as... This one's more on the brink, but he loses to Boxer there again. 3 losses in finals to Boxers now. 2003, he makes 2 more finals. He makes the Olympus OSL final, and this time he loses to Zelos. Now, Zelos was a good player, and he was famous for certain things. He was a very good Terran player, but he's not really a god, actually. This is one where... Now that you've lost this one does feel like a nobody's fault but my own. Like, you've got to the final this time, mate. There's no Boxer there. There's no Nada there. It's clear. The way's clear. This is time for you to get that OSL. And yeah, you're going to end with what would end up being a Stork type career. Like, you're going to have lost a bunch and win one at the end, but you can at least redeem some aspect of that. He doesn't do it. He loses to Zelos. He then made it to the final of the Trigum ASL, MSL rather. And here's his problem here. He loses to I Love Uvi. And it turns out that I Love Uvi, after Boxer, after Nada, is the next great godlike player who comes along and dominates and never loses a final. So it's like, yeah, that one I don't blame you that much for that. Also, that tournament was brutal because he'd actually, I remember Yellow in the upper bracket final, to get to the final from the upper bracket, had beaten Nada. So it's like he's finally beaten the guy who's the greatest at that period in time before this tournament, where it turns out I Love Uvi's rise starts at this tournament. That's when he loses to that guy. It's like, Jesus, like you just can't catch a break in that scenario. So nearly all these finals except one, really, you can't really say like, he's done about as well as he could in this particular sense. It's also worth pointing this out as well, that when you're talking about a guy who gets to this many finals, yeah, in this sense, it is that a lot of it is like he obviously breaks down under pressure. And a way that you can even see that is a quality that a lot of people might not actually understand about Yellow, which is people see here, so I've just described that there was 3 finals that he lost to Boxer. And he never won a big MSL or OSL type final. So people would naively think, okay, well, him versus Boxer, his rival, I'm sure his record versus his rival's terrible. No, actually not at all. Their rivalry, if you look at individual games played, is like incredibly close. It's like a couple of games either side. And some of these games were played in latter days that made up the numbers. It's incredibly... He beat Boxer almost as many times as Boxer beat him in games. In fact, he even won tournaments over Boxer and Nada. His problem was he would win a lot of the games against Boxer in stuff like Pro League, or he'd win it in separate tournaments that weren't the OSL or MSL, which is the equivalent in their day of GSL, or like the biggest tournament, or WCS finals. He would win in the small tournaments that we could call now. Just to give, this isn't a great analogy, but just to give a comparison, this would be the equivalent of if you played something like, I don't want to say a DreamHack. Yeah, maybe like a DreamHack Open, or maybe maybe a home story cup where it could have godlike players and you could play some amazing player in the final or the semi, but if you win it, it's never going to be the same. It's never going to match up to the pain of losing a massive final. And so actually he won many of these. He was even known as kind of like a specialist, a king of special tournaments. He would win those. It's like that made it even more tragic that he couldn't win the big final, because it's like he could win and beat these players seemingly almost any time, but he could just never do it in the big final. There was something, even though he's losing to a lot of gods, his is a combined scenario. He had both going against him, gods, and there's something in him that means he just can't win in this particular sense. And like I said, he made it to the round of 4 of these OSLs and MSLs 10 times. Well, remember, he only lost in the finals 5 times. So even then, sometimes he's beating some of these players to get there. Something happens when it gets deep in a tournament to yellow. And actually, yeah, that's kind of the problem in this sense, is that he just had everything against him. He's the ultimate finals loser in that particular sense. I mean, there's no real fair way to say it other than that. If we go beyond that, another one that they picked, another obvious one, this is a StarCraft 2 one, was Marine King. Marine King Prime, people call him because he was so famously in Prime for so long, so I'll call him Marine King. He made the GSL Open final, Season 2 final, second big Korean tournament. He lost there to Nesty, who obviously goes on to be one of the greatest players ever, won 3 GSLs over the next year and a half or so. In fact, if a calendar year, I think he won the 3 GSLs in. He makes it to the final of GSL Code S for 2011 January, which was 2 GSLs later, and he loses there to MVP. And MVP now just rises up, and MVP obviously, up until today, some people might even still call him the greatest player of all time. This was his era when he became dominant. So these 2 finals, I don't really blame you that much. Nesty wasn't quite in God mode at the time, but he was pretty much on the track. So these are gods initially. Marine King made it to the GSL World Championship final early on in 2011. He plays MVP again, loses to MVP again. MVP's in God mode at this point in time. Now, beyond that, he has a little stretch. The rest of 2011 doesn't make any finals. Then actually, let me just make a point there before I leave that aspect. Because a piece of trivia people might not know is that the consistency level of Marine King here shows that even though it was gods that he was playing, there was also something about him. It was a combined one with him, because he made it to the top 8 of his first 5 out of his first 7 events, including, let me think, like 4 or 5 GSLs. So 5 of his first 7, he made the top 8, and at 4 of his first 7, he made the top 4, and he made the final like 3 times or something. So just as a consistent player, he was one of the most consistent players in the entire world, one of the best players in the world, definitely, and could beat a lot of players and was very skilled. But there's also something clearly about him where he did break down in some sense once he got to these finals, even though in some of them he's playing gods. Now in 2012, here's what makes his career interesting. His career is actually most comparable probably to someone like, probably to Jangbi. Maybe not Jangbi actually, let me think. Maybe more like Fantasy, because in 2012, he had this run of 3 MLG tournaments in a row where he made the final. And all 3 times, he played the same person in the final. He played Dongre-gu. The first 2 times, MLG Winter Arena, MLG Winter Championship, he beats Dongre-gu in the final. The guy who's always finished second, Marine King, has beaten Dongre-gu, and he's won 2 MLG titles. Okay, they're not as good as GSL Code S titles, but they're still good foreign titles. Then he plays the same guy in the Spring Arena final, Dongre-gu, and he loses to him this time. So it's like, that's why I kind of brought up the like a Stalker or a Fantasy type reference, because they did win in the middle, but then they also lost afterwards, as if to say, no, I am still that guy. So, I mean, Dongre-gu is one of the greatest players ever. He's not quite, in terms of greatness, on the caliber of what MVP and Nesty did in their eras of when they were winning it and beating Marine King Prime at this point in time. So, yeah, I have no problem putting Marine King up there as one of the greatest kings of silver in StarCraft 2, even though he did win in the end. I think he actually is very firmly in that category. He'd be top 2 or 3 in terms of StarCraft 2 for me. Su is a modern day example. I think, actually, for me, Su would be my number 1 guy in StarCraft 2 context. And I'd even say that he's probably the only guy on this list who actually can challenge Yellow for, like, greatest loser in finals or king of silver. But Yellow also maybe has the edge in terms of sheer number of times he's reaching top 4s and stuff. The problem with Su is you want to say there's a Hector Achilles thing happening where he's playing great players. Because everyone he plays, it's their season, not just because they win, but their season in terms of this is like the height of their career. But he loses to a different person in every final. So I actually have to lean more towards the nobody's fault but my own one for Su. He made it to the final of WCS Korea Season 3 in 2013. He plays Deer there. Now, competitive series, but Deer wins, and obviously Deer goes on to then win Season 3 itself, the final, so we know Deer's in God mode. Okay, that one I'll give you credit for. That's kind of a god at that point in time. No one could have beaten him in those two tournaments. You lose that one, Protoss player Deer. Then in 2014, the next WCS, he plays in the Season 1 final against Zest, another Protoss. Obviously, Zest, we now know, had a great run of form and had some 6 tournaments over the first sort of 6 months of the year. He loses to him here. Again, I can put this one down to kind of a god mode one, that one there. Those two are fair enough. Those count in that sense. It's these next ones that get more difficult, okay? Because the very next GSL final, he's now made 3 GSL finals in a row. This is unreal. No one's done this before. Makes 3rd GSL final in a row. Season 2 of WCS Korea in 2014. He plays Classic, Protoss player. It's 3rd Protoss in a row, actually. He loses to Classic. Now, this one I can't really give you a buy on, because this one was like a nobody's fault my own. Classic is not some all-time great play. He's never going to be in anyone's top 10. I don't even know if he's make the top 20 of all time. In fact, if we think of all the GSL and every single type of champion there was in StarCraft 2, this is one where this one should have been the one that Sue got. He should have won this one, really. He made it to the next. He makes it to the DreamHack Open Stockholm final in sort of, I think it was around September of 2014. Makes it to the final here, and he loses to Solar, the Zerg player. Now, Solar is not a god in any sense. This one really is like, after the first two, we kind of gave you a pass on the Deer and Zest ones. They were gods in their prime to a degree, especially in their race. Classic, not so much. That he's kind of a one-off, and you've lost to him. Now you lose to Solar. Solar's not a great godlike player. So this one really starts to make us question, like, it feels like you can lose to anyone now. Like, there's a lot of this losing is coming down to you. Because here's the thing. The other factor that goes against Sue in terms of making it more nobody's fault but my own is that even though Deer won those 2 tournaments, and even though Zest won that, if you look at this whole spanner when he's making all these finals, except for the fact he could never win one, Sue is the most consistent and probably the best StarCraft 2 player in the world. Because everywhere except the final, he's incredible. He's always... he can play anyone in a semi-final, he's going to beat them. He's having this insane run. He's beating all races. Having 6 runs, beating different people in all these different rounds of 8, different semis, and he's still losing to now, it seems like anyone in finals. So he loses to Solar there, and right afterwards he makes it to the Season 3 WCS Korea finals for last year. Here he plays Innovation, and Innovation, it's been a while since he's been winning big tournaments. That was like over a year ago. He loses to Innovation here, heartbreaking loss, and that's also a factor. This tournament right here really sealed it that, like, okay, Sue really is a massive king. I mean, listen, even if he'd have won now, that wouldn't have made up for it. In fact, that's a general point I should have probably made at the beginning. One of the reasons why it is significant that you lose a bunch of times, even if you then win, there's a naive problem that people have who aren't competitors, especially at the highest level, where they think to themselves, man, since they're not a good player, and they watch and they think, oh, how exciting to win. They will naively, I literally mean naively, they don't have experience and they don't understand the way this is. They will think to themselves, oh, to win just even one of those would be incredible. You'd remember it for the rest of your life. What a great day. You'd be on top of the world. That's true. If you were an average level player who couldn't normally make a final, if you won one, that would be amazing. If you're just a nobody sat at home, yes, to imagine to win one would be great. But if you can make multiple finals, odds are, unless you really are playing the best players ever, odds are you could win more than one. You could win 2 or 3. You could maybe even win all the finals you're in. So if you go to all these finals and you have the expectation every time that you could win them all, and you don't win them all, in fact you lose the majority of them, you're going to be devastated. Even winning that one time, which will have pleasure and be a great moment in itself, that's like a good thing happens to you here doesn't make up for totally separate bad things happening to you. That doesn't work at all. It's good here and it's good in its own right, but it doesn't somehow make up. It's not a scale that's being balanced out. Those bad things still happen to you. So it's like, yeah, that happened, but these bad things still happen. In the same sense, that's what happens here. Especially because if you keep making it back to these finals, that means there is a sense you have to sort of regroup and then battle on and keep playing incredible level and keep finding ways to get past this new opponent and adapt your style, and then you're still losing. Still losing. Adapt more, still losing. And when you win, it's not like the end of a book, like, oh, and that's the end of that chapter. It's kind of like when, to give another real world example, people will say in real life, like they'll hear about some millionaire type guy or whatever, or they'll hear about some famous pro player who gets like a contract. Okay, he makes a contract for $30 million a year, and then maybe he had like a dispute with his team, and his team was only offering him $27 million a year, and they'll be like, oh, he's fucking greedy, he is. I'd take $5 million a year. Yeah, of course you would, mate, because you're not a world-class athlete. And to you, $5 million is a lot more than you have. So to you, $5 million is a big deal. And yeah, you would do this, that, the other. But if you were in his position and you knew your value was $30 million, or maybe even more, but $30 million is the cap, you're not going to settle for anything less than $30 million. In fact, if you get 25, you might feel disrespected, like I've been ripped off, like that's not what I should have gotten. In the same sense as, when everyone says, oh, if I won the lottery for like $5 million, I give $1 million to my mum and I'd do this. You know what? Most people who win the lottery like that don't do that. Part of the reason why they don't is because it's easy to say that when you don't have the money. When you then have the money, to then give away like a fifth or a tenth of it is actually a massive deal. If I ask you right now, just for no reason, just because you have it, just give away a tenth of whatever you have to me, or a fifth, like you'd be like, no, I need that. Like, yeah, it's interesting how perspective works, isn't it? Back into the zone of StarCraft 2 now. So in this particular sense, it doesn't take away the pain of losing to have lost. So it still does. Those losses change a person, and winning doesn't fix those problems in general. And also, I'll give you another sports example. This is a great one that I always think of. A famous sports example of a King of Silver type scenario is Jerry West, who in the early days of the NBA, in the 1960s, going into the early 70s, was in the finals. I think he made like 6 NBA finals or something, and he lost like the first 4 or 5. And a bunch of them were to the Boston Celtics, who were one of the greatest teams ever, and they won like 11 titles in that era. Now, because he'd lost all these other times, when he finally won, by the way, with what at the time was the greatest team ever and had the best season ever, then won and had just an amazing season. And yeah, he even said, yeah, I could enjoy that and it was amazing. But he even said the joy of winning that one never made up for the pain of losing the others. And the rest of his life was still shaped by thinking back and not being able to get over the trauma of losing those others. So just to put it in perspective, why it's not enough to think that if you just win once, it erases the rest of this past. It doesn't. The past still exists. You've just added a better chapter. You didn't fuck up that chapter, essentially. Anyway, back to the Marine King Prime thing. The Sue one, that's it. I'm back on Sue now. Now, when in that WCS Season 3 career, the reason why we kind of saw that he could lose to anyone here is because in the semi-finals he played Zest, the guy who'd beaten him in the Season 1 finals, remember? This time he beat Zest in a thrilling 4-3 semi. So it's like, wow, he's come through in the big game. He's gotten past that guy who'd beaten him before. He's got to the final. He's playing Innovation now. He's surely going to win now. He loses to Innovation there. Not only did he lose to Classic Solar Innovation, who weren't gods at the times that they won, they weren't in their best peak of form. Well, that just makes sense. Innovation wasn't in his best peak of form compared to the god mode of 2013 early on. I mean, for the other ones, they just weren't great players. He's lost to all of those, as well as the gods that he lost to early on. He's lost to all 3 races in the final. Even worse, every final, he always wins at least 2 maps. And you have to win 4 to win the final, remember. He always wins at least 2. So this just ultimately is telling you, listen, all races, all different opponents who aren't even in God mode, always getting halfway there and never making it. This just tells you, I'm afraid, like, actually, a big part of Sue's problem was Sue. It wasn't just his misfortune when he got to his finals. A big part of it, unfortunately, was Sue, and there's something in him where he just breaks down and he can't play in his finals, especially in the latter maps of the final, the way that he can in any other game. Any other game, he might be the best player in the world in this era. In a final, though, he becomes less than the best. Sometimes considerably so when he's losing to Solar or fucking Classic, these sorts of examples. Now, the fourth name, so I'd have him right up there with Yellow. In terms of StarCraft 2, he's the ultimate kind of King of Silver to me, and I think he's comparable to Yellow because of making so many in a row and losing. So he was having a god. He was, in some sense, like I'm saying, that his difference is he was the best in the world when he was losing, whereas Yellow was like the second best in the world when he's losing to all these other guys, in a sense. Like he's second best to Boxer, they second best to Nala, they second best to, that's kind of like it makes sense that he comes second. In Sue's, it never made sense in almost any of these finals that he came second. The fourth name that they had on this list, and this is the last one they did, was Squirtle. Now, here's one where actually I have to go ahead and just straight up say that I don't really... When you see some of the names I'll add later, I don't think Squirtle should actually have been on this list. Like, I don't think he really is worthy of it in terms of, like, he doesn't have enough sustained seconds, even though I will give it to him that he probably should have won some of these. So he only had 3 big seconds. He made it to the Season 2 GSL final in 2012, and this is one where he played MVP, and he lost in the 7th map, in the last game, to this amazing cheese by MVP that he initially held off. One of the best games ever. The real problem here is, on paper, he should have won. He thrashed Tasia 3-0. He thrashed Hero 3-0. He mugs to the final. He's playing MVP. MVP is famously weak against Protoss. Now, when I say weak, I mean for a god, that's his weakest matchup. He wasn't weak outright. It's just he wasn't a god in that matchup. But in this tournament, he'd amazingly beaten all these other amazing Protoss. He'd beaten Nanoa, he'd beaten Parting, and now he makes it to the final against Squirtle, who at the time, by the way, was the guy really leading PvT. He was the guy really inventing a lot of this shit, and that people were kind of copying their stuff from him. So you're thinking, okay, he's barely made it past them. He'd had to use cheese against some of those guys. How's he going to get past Squirtle? Somehow MVP does. Squirtle's forced to finish second. Not that long afterwards, you have the IPL 4 tournament. Squirtle goes here, and he has this sick lower bracket run where he goes all these matches in a row, beating all these players, makes it to the final and plays Alive, another Terran player, and he loses here. Now, this one, I'd say it's more than 50-50, but the fact that he had to do all that grueling lower bracket, I can kind of understand why he lost there. Alive was very much in his form here, but Alive wasn't a god. That's something to point out. Then you had WCS Korean final in 2012. Which wasn't WCS like GSL. It was back when it was just like regional tournament only, feeding into a massive WCS. He lost here to Creator, who had a little run of form here. He was one of the best Protoss at this point in time. But Creator's a really young guy. Squirtle, after those other losses, you'd think if he gets another chance at another crack, he's going to make it this time. This time he's lost. So in this one, I can't really say he was facing gods here, because even though he faced MVP, that was MVP almost at his weakest, with like the fucked up wrists and like a miracle run and all this guts. He won on guts and grit and the ability to just outthink the opponent, not on like mad skills and he's the best player in the world. It's so obvious. No, not really. So he didn't lose to gods. It was kind of his own fault to a degree, some of these, and he's only made it to 3. So when you see some of the other names in this list, I think I'd have Squirtle right near the bottom. He might be the least important King of Silver on my whole list. So now I'll start adding in some other ones for you. So, starting StarCraft 2, got to put in Jaedong, or as Koreans would say, Chedong. Now, the problem with Jaedong is, in Brood War, he is one of the greatest winners of all time. Like, if I had to rank the best Brood War players of all time, Jaedong would, at worst, probably be like 3rd or 4th ever to play Brood War. He won 5 overall big titles over OSL and MSL, were the 2 most important ones. Only 2 players won more tournament titles than that, and that was Flash and Nada won 6. So he's incredible. Now, interestingly, in Brood War, you can't at all call him a loser, but he did lose his last 3 finals. He got silvers, but they were all to Flash when Flash was ultimate god mode in 2010, having the best year anyone ever had. So I don't really count those as like big silver losses. But coming to StarCraft 2, and Jaedong went on this run in 2013 where he finished in something like 5 straight finals, 2nd place. So we had DreamHack Summer. He lost to Stardust. Now, let's not even pretend like, of all the names I've ever mentioned so far who's beaten anyone on a list, Stardust's the worst by far. Stardust's not even close to a good. He's not even a great player. He's not even a very good player. He was just a good player who found out how to grind in terms of using weird, wacky gamble builds, and he managed to win this tournament, a one-off. He manages to win this. And obviously he won stuff later, but I mean, in this particular sense, the tournament, the way it played out was very much a one-off. It was very much like, wow, what great fortune. It's that thing of it's better to be lucky to be good, in a sense. He beats Jaedong here. Okay, Jaedong's first final, he loses it. Jaedong makes the DreamHack Valencia final. He loses here to Hyun. Now, Hyun has won other stuff, does win other stuff, so it's not terrible here. Hyun's better than Stardust, certainly in terms of great players, but not a god. This was a winnable final. Jaedong lost this one as well. So it's not looking good already. He makes it to the WCS Season 2 America Finals. He plays Polt there. And Polt hasn't won big stuff for years at this point in time, like over a year. Probably approaching 2 years, actually. But Polt wins this. Again, here you're thinking like, Jaedong, this feels like you're the one who's losing these ones, not these other guys winning as much as, yeah, they win the individual match, but you're good enough to get to these finals. You're really in form. And what's interesting, actually, about the way Jaedong was playing was he would decimate opponents on the way. He would actually be clutch in matches. In a series, ignoring getting to the final, he would be clutch. He would come from behind. He would like get that clutch turnaround victory, kind of like the Ihihan timing, the one moment of timing that he did famously in his Ever OSL 2007 final against Stock. He would find that little moment to win the match, that decisive play, decisive clutch. This is how we thought of this guy, and yet he would make it to these finals and lose each time. So he wasn't clutch in that particular sense in the big final. WCS Season 2 Finals itself, he lost to Bomber after having this great run through the tournament, even overcoming Nanoa, who'd beaten him previously in some series. WCS Global Finals, the biggest tournament of the year in terms of prize money. Jaedong makes it to the final. He's looking great. Everyone's thinking, wow, this time not only is he going to break it like his curse of seconds, but he's going to win the biggest tournament and win the most money. Yeah, it's a great way to go. Jaedong, the champion's back. Then he gets totally fucking mind game, like owned. SOS. wins this final and just toys with Jaedong. He's like inside his head, just predicting, reading, almost like implanting thoughts, like Inception style of what to do next, so that when he then does it, it's like, yeah, that's what I thought you were going to do, and here's my counter that I had prepared already 2 minutes before you set off to attack me here. Like, just unreal toying with him, and he loses this massive final in devastating fashion. Now, right after that, he did win a title. He won the small Northcon tournament where he beat Innovation in the semis, he beat Scarlet in the final. This is a tournament that had Innovation's life in it. It wasn't terrible, but it's nothing compared to this one especially does not compare to the pain of some of those losses, especially the WCS Global Finals. So in a StarCraft 2 context, I wouldn't put Jaedong up at the Su level. I don't think he's up at the yellow level because, first of all, he's a great winner historically. And then secondly, because even though he has a lot of silvers, a bunch are like foreign tournaments, and even the foreign tournaments aren't some of the absolute best tournaments. Like some of the DreamHack Summer, etc., they aren't like even the top of the tier 2 level tournaments. Winning Northcon, who gives a fuck about that? WCS America, again. Yeah, WCS Global Finals, that's very legit. That's like close to a GSL type level, so that's a big loss. So even though there's a lot of silvers, I don't think it's comparable to like what happened to Su, and especially not yellow. Now, some Brood War names now, because there was a bunch of famous guys in Brood War who we have to talk about. I would talk first of all about Stork. Stork made it to the final of GOM TV's MSL Season 2 in 2007, and he was playing Bisu there. And Bisu had beaten Savior in legendary fashion and won the previous season, so Bisu's the best player in the world. Stork's not a favourite to win this. It's PvP, it's a great series, it goes 5 games. Stork loses very close fashion because he didn't upgrade Dragoon range or some shit, and so he can always think back and go, oh, if I'd done that, I'd have won the 5th game. So in this one, it doesn't feel like, yeah, it feels like he had a chance to win, but he's playing the best player in the world. Okay, he loses, fair enough. He then plays the Ever OSL at the end of the... Let me think. At the end of the year, he plays the Ever OSL final, and he has a sick run to get there. He beats Flash, he beats Bisu, he overcomes Bisu. He plays Jaedong in the final. This is Jaedong's first final. Jaedong's like a rookie finalist. This is the Royal Road, in fact, that Jaedong's walked to get there. And in the final, Stork wins the first game, he's winning the second game, and then Jaedong turns it around, Jaedong wins 3-1. This one's kind of like, at the time, what's funny is you think to yourself, wow, Stork blew it. Maybe there's something wrong with the Stork guy that he's lost here. But actually, historically, we now know Jaedong goes on to become one of the best players ever. Now, he wasn't actually in his God mode peak then. He still had a lot to learn and develop. It would be like a year to 2 years later that Jaedong really went ultra God mode. But Jaedong's historically a very good player. So it's a mix of the two there. He maybe could have got him there, but he is historically a great player. So he's lost to 2 godlike players already. Then you go to 2008, and there was a GOM tournament. This wasn't an MSL or an OSL, though. It was they had this invitational tournament that kind of was like a tier 2 event. But in terms of the talent pool, it wasn't that far from an OSL type of thing. He plays Flash in the final. This is Flash's first final, who obviously goes on to be a god later on, the best player ever. But at the time, he's just a young player who's rising up. He plays Flash here, loses to him in very close fashion. There's another one that could be won. His first 3 finals, Stork was really in with a chance to win them, but he doesn't have what it takes at the end or in a clutch game that it always gets turned on him. This is really close, and the way that Stork plays, actually, people think, wow, he could get him if he played him again there. Well, right afterwards, a couple of weeks later, or maybe even a week later, he plays the Bacchus OSL final against Flash, and Flash mind games him by tricking him by saying, like, try that build, the anti-carrier build that you tried, like, I'll beat it. And then Flash doesn't do that. He does this insane early aggression and wins in like 15 minutes. He just smashes this final. Stork gets wrecked. Now Stork's lost twice in a row to Flash. Now, admittedly, Flash later would go on to be a god, but these were like the only 2 titles that Flash won in this era. Yeah, later on he'd win like one of the bad GOMs when there wasn't that many good players in because the teams withdrew. But he was just the best player at this time. And this was his first peak. So I will give credit that historically, you look back and it's hard for Stork to win those. Later on in the same year, Stork makes it to the Incruit OSL final. And there's only 3 OSLs a year, remember. He plays Fantasy here. And Fantasy's a rookie, making the Royal Road run where you haven't ever played in an OSL before, but you make it to the final. And Stork wins this time. He wins the final in his clutch 5th game. He gets his title. All the pain's gone, except it isn't, as I've described there. But anyway, in the narrative of the shitty movie, that's what people would say. So he's won one finally. There isn't any more finals for Stork for a few years. Skip ahead, and in 2011, he makes it to the Bacchus OSL final. And his opponent is Fantasy again. Now, this time there's some other factors, like Stork's girlfriend broke up with him a week before. Turns out Fantasy had some sick sort of mind game counter builds that he came up with, and Fantasy wrecks him and sweeps him 3-0. Stork's out, he's done. He's lost his, let me think, what was that? 3-6, I think that's his 6th final. Yeah, if you count the GOM Invitational one. In his 6th final, he's only taken 1 title from it. And in the ones that count, he's only won 1. Now, there's a few factors to think of here. First of all, with Stork, he really did clearly. His problem is it was both for him, kind of like the yellow one to a degree. He was playing gods. I mean, fucking hell, he played Bisu in a final, Jaedong in a final, Flash in 2 finals. Those are gods. That, like, you could make a case that they're the best player for the best player for their races in history. So he's playing gods. A lot of those finals he's supposed to lose and he's going to lose. And amazingly, he came close to winning those. So actually, I give him a lot of credit for some of those losses. More so than some people who just won easier tournaments where it was like good players got eliminated in the best of one stage, you know. But he did also show that he had a breakdown aspect to himself, where even when he was playing great, he could find a way to lose. And he made it to 3 WCG finals. He won his first one in 2007, he lost 2008, he lost 2009. So clearly there was something to Stork where he could lose to a degree. Now, Fantasy in the end is a great player, but he's on the level of a Stork, and they split 1-1 there. Now, this adds up to a little aspect that I want to add in here as well. This is also why winning doesn't necessarily make up for being a loser. Because Stork, Fantasy, and Jangbi all had the same story of losing a bunch, then winning an OSL, but all 3 of them only won their OSLs against each other. So at that point in time, I mean, I can't even give you a 100% credit there, because it's like, okay, you're amazing, except when you get to finals. Yep, I am. Right, what if you were to play someone else who's amazing, except when he gets to finals? I guess one of us would have to win that, wouldn't they? Yes. And that's what happened to all 3 of them. That's how they all won their OSL titles. So you didn't really get over any hump there. You just played another guy who also has to lose, but someone has to be the winner. So of the battle of the guys who are going to lose, someone has to fucking win. Obviously, that's kind of facetious because some of these finals were great, especially the Jangbi Fantasy ones. Going forwards, so where would I rank Stork? Definitely Stork's right up there. Even though he did win an OSL, let me think, historically. I'm going to have Yellow and Sue first. I'd probably put Stork second, just because his greatness was that. The difference is, a lot of these finals he really should or could have won in terms of just play. Now, he couldn't in the sense that some of these guys were gods, but then to even come that close against the gods, it feels like Stork's the guy to me who really, on paper, should have had more titles. Like, he should have taken a couple of these. Not all of them. It's not like he should have been the best player ever, but he maybe should have taken the first one against Jaedong, and maybe he could have taken the first against Bisu, and maybe one of the ones against Flash. Just pick even one of those, or 2 out of the 3, and it'll totally change the way their careers. And the other ones will still be great players and won a lot of tournaments, but he'll be close to them. He'll be a real peer of theirs. Whereas in terms of titles, he's not even in the same realm as any of those 3, Bisong, Jaedong and Flash. But in terms of his ability and his greatness, he should have been. And everything else was there, it just that aspect wasn't. Now moving on, the guy that he beat to win his title, Fantasy. Fantasy made it to the Incruit final, the one where he played Stork and he lost there in close fashion. He made it to the very next final. He played against Jaedong in the Batu OSL final. Now, what you couldn't have known was Jaedong would win this and the next one, and this is when he'd cement himself as the best player of his era, his generation at the time, until Flash won later, and just like a god of 2009. So I can't really blame Fantasy for losing that. I mean, I don't know what you're supposed to do there. Jaedong was incredible in that final. Skip years later, and in 2011, the Bacchus OSL final, Fantasy plays Stork again. He has this amazing win over him. He wins a title finally. The last 2 OSLs of Brood War, the next 2, Fantasy makes the next 2. He makes 3 OSLs in a row, which is incredible, by the way. The only people who'd ever done that, 3 OSLs in a row, was Flash, actually. Flash had made 3 in a row, and he won 2 out of the 3. And Fantasy's won his first one. He makes the Jin Air OSL final, and it's against Jangbi. And it goes to 5 games, and he loses narrowly to Jangbi. And Jangbi was also, at the time, had never won a title. Was famous as another loser, King of Silver. But you put 2 of them together, and it's Jangbi that comes out with the clutch Game 5 win with the carriers. That was fucking epic. The last final of Brood War, Teeving OSL final, Fantasy makes it there again. Fantasy smashes Flash to get there in the semi-finals. You're thinking, wow, he's going to win this one. He loses to Jangbi again, this time like 3-1, so it was more convincing for Jangbi, actually. And Jangbi was just clutch in these games. So actually, in Fantasy's case, yeah, he won a final, and he was in 5, but the way he lost at least 1 or 2 of them makes it like... Yeah, he played some godlike players. He didn't play as many gods, though, overall. Yeah, Jaedong was a god in that final. Stork wasn't really a god just because he couldn't accomplish it himself. And Jangbi definitely was, because he was also another loser. So the fact that Fantasy lost 3 of his finals to other guys who were thought of as losers and played 4 against them overall is like... I wouldn't put him as high as Stork, actually. I'd have him like a bit below, maybe like 5th or 6th sort of level there. Let's move on to Jangbi now, because he's the 3rd guy in this trifecta of the losers that played each other and won titles. Club Day MSL final in 2008, he plays Bisu, and Bisu was a god in 2007, but then he'd had a slump, and now this is Bisu's return, where Bisu has this sick run where he wins a couple of titles. He loses to Bisu there. He then, right after, plays in the GOM Classic 2 final against Bisu again, and Bisu wins that one. And listen, Bisu's one of the greatest players ever, so that one, I don't begrudge you losing that. But then he makes the next MSL final, the Lost Saga MSL final. He loses here to Luxury. And Luxury isn't a god. He was a good player at the time. He was one of the best Zergs, like a top 2 or 3 Zerg at the time. But he wasn't a god in any sense. This is one where Jangbi possibly could have won, but unfortunately at the time, he was famously not that great against Zerg, so that was part of his problem there. So it's a bit his own fault there. And then I described the last 2 finals. He played Fantasy in the GNR and the TVing OSL finals. And these were really clutch. They were really awesome. But even these wins, because it's against Fantasy, because it's at the end of Brood War, and because you've lost in those key scenarios before, you don't feel like a massive winner in that sense. You just did well and you won in these particular scenarios. But even though there's 5 finals here, he's not on the category of a yellow, these sorts of bits suits, etc. Nah, I wouldn't really put him up there. Now, here's a foreign one. I've got a foreign name for you guys. No one else thought of this one. You could actually put Nanowar in there. Now, if we're talking about major finals, Nanowar doesn't have that many, actually. He only has a couple, particularly of note. But if we add in all his finals, just to show the trend of losing, Nanowar could be the best foreigner. There was times when, like Sue style, he was the best foreigner, but he could also lose to almost anyone in these finals. So it's like he couldn't quite cement that in the way Stefano did when he was winning. He could be the best player of the foreigners at the time, but he could also find a way to lose to them. So some of these are quite minor, by the way. He lost in 2 Home Story Cup finals. The first one, Home Story Cup 2, he lost to White Ra. This was a very small tournament. This is like tier 5, I'd probably say. Even though it had some good players for Europeans at the time, it's not a big LAN. It's a small amount of people. It's a very friendly atmosphere. It's not a big deal. Not that big a deal. He won the MLG Dallas, but he won it over Kiwi Kaki. As soon as I say he won it over Kiwi Kaki, you know there weren't any Koreans there. There weren't godlike players. It's very early in StarCraft 2, early 2011. It's not a godlike win particularly. It was in the fashion he won it, but this isn't comparable to like GSL final. It's not even close. TSL 3 final, only the finals on LAN. He loses in the last game there to Thorzane. That's one where, like, if you lose in that particular fashion, it's like you probably could have won that. You choked a bit there. He was up 3-1 or something. He lost that one. Then he had Home Story Cup 3, a little bit bigger than the other one, but he loses again. This time he loses to Huck. Not particularly massive tournament. He's lost there. A smaller tournament but competitive was the qualifier for BlizzCon, the Battle.net Invitational EU. He lost to Rhett in the final there. At this point, you're really starting to think, this guy's losing to anyone in a final now. He's very good. His talent's really there, but something mentally is not there when he gets to finals. Amazingly, at the end of the year, one tournament he'd won, by the way, is he won towards the end of the year. MLG Providence was in like November, I think. He made it to the final, or maybe late October. He made it to the final of the MLG Global Invitational. It was only a four-man tournament, but he beat Nesty, 2-time GSL champion of that year. Within that year, he'd won 3 overall. He beat MVP, who'd won 3 titles that year, GSL. He beat both of them and won that little tournament. But it's only a little 4-man tournament. It's like the best exhibition tournament you could win, but that's about it. He plays in the main tournament final, the final of all of MLG that year, with like 50k first place. He wrecks all these great players in the upper bracket. Then, like Nesty, Dongregu. In the final, he plays against Lenok, and he loses by 1 game in the final, and Lenok beats him and takes that, what would have been the best, probably the best title any foreigner ever could and would have won in history, away from me. Loses it. He's lost again, but this time to someone who was kind of close to godlike form. I wouldn't say Lenok was a god, but this was a very good tournament run, and Lenok obviously would make the final of the next GSL. Skip forward a few years, because 2012, Nanua had excellent performances, but he never made any finals. In fact, he actually never made the round of 4 of any big tournament in 2012. Interesting piece of trivia for you there. Despite being a great foreigner and one of the best. 2013, he has this revival in Heart of the Swarm. He makes the final of DreamHack Open Stockholm, and he has to play Lenok there. His old rival who'd beat him in MLG Providence, and he loses there. He loses to Lenok here, and Lenok is not even vaguely god mode at this time. He's very good, but he's not like a god at this point in time. Towards the end of the year, to qualify for BlizzCon, Nanua needed to get a high placing at IEM 8 New York, and he makes it right to the final. He's beaten San, he beat Hyun, people who, at times have been very good players. Hyun was that year. San had been pretty good, but it's famously in 2011? I think that's when he was at his prime. He makes it to the final. He plays Life, who obviously is one of the greatest players of all time, and was having a resurgence of form. And he loses this final. So just to have a foreign name in there, well, not even just for that, he's worthy to be put in there in terms of the sheer number of seconds. He's there for just showing that he clearly did have this thing where he broke down in finals. He was a king of silver in that respect. Now, not on the level of some of the others. We're talking about GSL finals or OSL finals or MSL. It's not on that level, is it? Aside from the MLG Providence one. But the only foreigner who really should be on this list, really. Now, another StarCraft 2 name for you
is going to be Symbol. Now, he's up there more in the category of... I'd put him around the level near the bottom of the list with Squirtle. He made the Iron Squid final in France. He lost to MMA there. It was one of MMA's last big tournaments before he had that big slump for like almost a year. He made it to the MLG Spring 2 Arena final. Lost to Violet there. That was one of Violet's big wins. These guys aren't gods in this particular period of time. Well, MMA was still very good. He made it to the Home Story Cup 6 final at the end of the year, and he lost out. He got utterly smashed there by Snoot in the final, who just had a miraculous run that tournament. Was one of the best foreigners at the time, but that was just a miracle run that tournament. That's everything. The way it went was like storybook, and he got totally smashed there. He made the first GSL final of 2013, and he lost to Roro there. And this was a one-off, and it was the last Wings of Liberty GSL, so Roro wasn't in a sense of God. If you look at the players he's losing to here, Symbol really did have some sort of mental issues when it came to finals. And I also, in general, if I'm being fair, aside from like the Snoot one, and then the Violet one was probably a toss-up. Yeah, here's the problem. He's not playing gods. And so he's not playing gods. And they're not even finals that necessarily he can't win. He just doesn't. So it's not very impressive. These aren't monster tournaments. He's down there with Squirtle and Nano at the bottom of this list. Nano at the bottom of the list. I guess I'd probably have to be reasonable and do that. I've got 2 more names for you. Actually, someone else is going to be bottom of this, I just realised. 2 more names that I had was Chodja in Brood War. A name that probably people wouldn't even think to have on this list. But when you hear his results, you'll realise why he's worthy to be. In the 4th KPGA Tour, remember the precursor of the MSL, the one that was Nada was winning, and he won the first 3? No, it doesn't make sense. Boxer won the first one, then Nada won the next 3. He plays Nada in the 4th one, and Nada's won the last 2. And he loses to Nada here. Okay, fair enough. And he actually, what's interesting is both him and Nada were the first people to make dual finals of the MSL, well, Keeper GL and OSL. They're first to make dual finals. Both of them made the KPGA 4th Tour and the Panasonic OSL final. And Nada won both of them. He gave Chodja losses in both. So you're playing a god in his peak era, and you have to play him in both finals. Like, you can't get more unlucky than that. Also, you weren't supposed to win him, so you couldn't have won those in some sense. He makes it in 2000, I think it was 2004. Let me think. It must have been 2005, I think, early 2005. He made it to the LG Cylon MSL final. And he actually, amazingly here, manages to beat Xavier in the final. And Xavier goes on to be one of the greatest Zergs ever, if not the greatest Zerg, second best Zerg ever. So this is actually a final where, what's weird is on a King of Silver list, this is a final where you shouldn't win. On paper, you shouldn't win. You're playing a god, and you actually do win. So amazingly, he won that one. Then he made it to the Shinhan Bank OSL Season 1 final, and he lost here to Casey, who isn't in any sense a god, was only good really at that matchup. It was kind of a fluky run, and so that is what brings you back down. So you played 3 gods, you won once against one of them, but then you lost someone who wasn't even close to a god. So in a weird way, I think Chodja deserves to be around the middle of the pack there. Not pretty good overall. And the last name I thought, actually I've got one more foreigner, I forgot about this. One more foreigner I should mention, and he's going to be at the bottom because none of these are close to a GSL or even the MLG Providence level, but Mana. People probably wouldn't have thought of this one. He made it to 5 big finals. I say big, I'll go through them. DreamHack Winter Final in 2010. It's not big. There's not great players here. There's only like 2 Koreans and they're not elite ones. They're like fucking top, etc. Like, yeah, who gives a shit? Not a great final, but he loses there to Nama. Again, not a great player, not a god, not anything. Wouldn't even be probably most people's top 30 foreigners of all time. At the time, decent. And he loses to Nama there. And Nama plays Terran, and it was Terran at the end of 2010. Anyway, so in DreamHack Summer 2011, Mana makes the final, and he plays Demaga, and he loses a heartbreaker, a really close series. He makes ESWC final a few months later. He loses to Stefano there, quite convincingly. Now, here's what's great about the end of Mana's career in the sense of the finals he makes. He then makes the same 2 finals again. He makes DreamHack Summer final, and he makes ESWC final. He wins both, and the way he does it is awesome. He meets Demaga in a rematch in DreamHack Summer 2012 final, and he beats him this time. In the semi-finals at ESWC, he meets Stefano, and he beats Stefano. He makes it to the final, he beats 4GG. Awesome storyline there. Not really. These aren't. He should be definitely bottom of the list. These aren't that great. I thought I'd just throw him in there, have another foreign name. So anyway, I've kind of gone through a lot of the different names there, a lot of their different runs, characterized it. But you can see that when you're breaking it down, even when you're analyzing people's losses, you don't just look at how many did they lose. You look at the quality of it, not just the quantity. You look at who did he play, what strength was he in, what kind of a favourite was he going into the final, what was the way he lost the final. Did he get 2 or 3 maps? Did he just get smashed completely? What types of pattern do we see when he plays in finals? Is it a particular race that he wasn't good at? What's the matchup in the final? There's all these different factors, and when you add them up, you'll get, not only will you be able to rank who really is the greatest and whatnot, but how great they were and how many they should have won. You can kind of get these analysis from that. So it's an interesting topic to me. I've always been interested in those guys who make it there again and again, but something inside them loses, because that tied into the story of the great winners really tells a lot of the story of the elite echelon of these different games. StarCraft 2, StarCraft Brood War. There's StarCraft's Silver Sovereigns.